have practiced and taught copyright for 45 years or so, and for the most part, I'm, as you might expect, very well disposed toward this general body of law. Copyright has been good to me, and I think by and large copyright has been good to the culture, to the society. But there is an old adage that teaches that it is always possible to have too much of a good thing. And we may, I think, today be in such a position where copyright, and in particular, where the demands of copyright compliance on various sectors of cultural practice are concerned. The situation is, I think, particularly difficult for a field like archival practice, which gets almost incidentally sideswiped by the general culture of copyright compliance. So today I want to talk briefly about three topics that relate to the U.S. situation where the problem set that you've heard described so well this morning is concerned. And our situation is a little different from the situation of the UK because we are working through this set of issues through risk analysis that is being conducted in the shadow of the fair use doctrine. So I'll talk a little bit about fair use in general and where it stands in the United States today, as I understand it. I'll talk a little about a few examples of relevant, very recent case decisions from U.S. courts relating to fair use, which have significance for the archival enterprise or for the performance of archival functions. And then I want to take a very quick look with you at the so-called best practices project, with which I've been involved with many wonderful colleagues for the last decade or so, and to talk a little bit about how some of that work may have a bearing on these issues. But first, if I may, I want to lead off with an old copyright lawyer's reflection on the relationship between doctrine, on the one hand, and risk management on the other. I agree, of course, with the point that was emphasized this morning in Christy Henshaw's slide, and that a number of other speakers have confirmed since, that decisions about copyright clearance, when to do it, how to do it, and how much to do it, are always considerations based in the end on a vision of risk and of risk tolerance in a particular institution. We can't dispute that proposition. But for myself, I subscribe to the notion that risk analysis ought to proceed on the basis of, as thorough as possible, an understanding of the applicable law. Risk analysis conducted in the absence of such an understanding is dangerous. One may, without a solid understanding of the law, of what it is, and of the direction in which it's moving, one runs, I think, there is a significant chance, I think, that in risk analysis one may either overshoot or undershoot the mark. In other words, I think that the work of trying to clarify the law and its application through interpretation and also sometimes through advocating for better rules is an essential input into the risk management activity. And with that, let me talk about fair use. First of all, in one sense, fair use has been an integral part of the U.S. copyright system since the middle of the 19th century when the judges first thought it up. And it's been essential because from its origins, it's always been clear that it had a close relationship, in theory, to the fulfillment of the core constitutional purpose of copyright in the United States, that is to promote cultural flourishing. It's also been recognized that fair use is present in our law for another rather essential theoretical reason, and that is that it helps to promote and safeguard free speech values, which might otherwise be at risk through over-enforcement of copyright norms. So that's all very good in theory. It's been running sort of in the background of American law for a long time. But its emergence as a practically significant feature of our law really dates back only about 20 years to the judicial embrace of the proposition that the cultural or expressive or communicative purpose of a significant or substantial unlicensed use of copyrighted material is the single most significant consideration in determining whether that use should nevertheless be considered non-infringing. So educational uses receive significant deference, and, of course, so do so-called transformative uses. And this is the rubric that has emerged in our court decisions over the last 20 years or so that has been embraced by judges in every region and at every level. The notion that transformative uses, those which involve reusing material to convey a new message or to address a new audience or to communicate substantial new informational value, are in general privileged uses. They may be educational, they may not be educational. They may be nonprofit or they may be for-profit. They may be parody or critical commentary, but they need not be. They may also be uses in the nature of illustration. So, in particular, these case decisions of the last 20 years, the accumulation of precedents, has taught us that recontextualizing copyrighted material without modifying it, without painting mustaches on it or shrinking it or filtering it in some way, also can and often does qualify as transformative fair use. Furthermore, because this fair use doctrine, which is codified in Section 107 of the 1976 copyright, is aggressively open-ended and hence occasionally criticized for being vague and unpredictable, because it is open-ended, there's actually no obvious limit on how or to what activities, present or future, it may be applied. The other thing that's important to recognize about fair use is its relationship to the other, more specific exceptions that are scattered throughout the U.S. copyright statute, and in particular, since it's of immediate concern here today, to the archival and library exceptions that are found in Section 108, and which, as Peter Hurdle will explain to you in a little while, haven't been updated for a very long time and don't show any clear sign of being updated anytime soon. We know, because the statute tells us so, that fair use supplements and complements these specific exceptions in Section 108, and the fact that a particular activity in which an archive may engage in the course of its digitization program isn't literally covered by Section 108 merely gives rise to the next question, that is, whether it may in fact be covered by fair use. So, in fact, fair use can and does reach activities like preservation and access, which are at the heart of the archival enterprise, and in particular at the heart of the move toward both digital preservation and the provision of remote access to archival collections. And it can do that without regard to the specific kind and character of the copyrighted material involved, or even the exact nature of the institution engaged in archival activities. I was interested in the last session in the discussion of the definition of an archive that will be or won't be, as the case may be, part of the new UK legislation. The wonderful thing about fair use, as we have it and practice it in the United States, is that we really don't have to worry about that question, because any entity that performs positive cultural functions, be it a great institution like this one, or be it a small personal website which curates and presents examples of the culture of the past, can qualify under this important exception. So that's my first proposition, a little bit in general about fair use. And now I want to talk a very, very brief amount about recent case law with a focus on one case, which is the 2012 decision of Judge Harold Baer in Authors Guild against HathiTrust. And I have to say at the outset that I'm not an entirely objective observer or reporter here, because I am of counsel in that case to one of the parties defendant, the National Federation of the Blind. But putting my lack of objectivity aside, here's what I think I can say, and I think that others will agree with. My colleagues will keep me honest here about the decision's implications for archival practice. What went on in that case, you know well. It was a kind of a spur line off the main track of the Google Books litigation, the Authors Guild having declined to sue the libraries that had provided Google with, give or take, 12 million books, some 60% perhaps of which are under copyright for digitization, decided at the last minute that they, after all, were going to try to draw the libraries in as defendants in an additional litigation. My clients, the National Federation of the Blind, and several blind individuals joined as additional parties defendants early in this litigation. And the case was litigated on the issue of fair use, especially, although not exclusively, as fair use analysis may be informed by other policies, including the important policy of providing accessible materials to print-disabled people, which is expressed in the United States in, among other things, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In that case, the judge declares that this whole enterprise of the HathiTrust participating in making the copies and then using them for a variety of different purposes constituted fair use. And his finding in particular was based on the notion that this vast and unprecedented digital collection would serve a preservation function, one that in fact goes well beyond the limited carve-out for preservation in Section 108, which again Peter Hurdle is going to discuss, because it enables search, and especially text mining, about which Matt Sag is going to have more to say in a moment, over very large amounts of information, and of course that the digital scans that are in the HathiTrust can dramatically facilitate the delivery of accessible copies to print-disabled students, teachers, scholars, and others. And this list, it's fair use because it serves preservation, because it promotes new modes of search and text mining, and because it promotes accessibility, was the sum total of all the justifications advanced by the defendants in the case. Judge Baer didn't miss one of them. Now, the decision's on appeal, and it's always possible, although I actually don't think it's likely that the higher court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, may somehow trim back that rationale of decision a bit. But at least as it stands, this application of fair use to one particular kind of digital project has larger implications for the archival enterprise. That is, the cultural justifications that are embraced in the HathiTrust opinion are now merely examples of the kinds of justifications that could be advanced successfully, in my view, for a variety of other mass digitization projects. Of course, let me put it this way, we have other advantages in the United States which you don't enjoy in thinking about copyright as it relates to mass digitization. One of them is that our law, at least, permits one co-owner of a copyrighted work to authorize its use for most purposes, subject to a duty to account to other co-owners. In cases of joint authorship, we don't require a majority or a consensus or a unanimous approval on the part of joint owners. That makes things easier. Another thing that makes it easier is that although United States law suffers from having a rather sort of swinging statutory damages provision, which often strikes fear in the hearts of users and I would say both institutional and individual users, there is a nice provision written into our law that says that anyone who is in an archival or library capacity and proceeds in good faith to engage in reproduction or distribution or dissemination of material on the basis of fair use can be shielded from statutory damages. Now, of course, as we know, in most cases of the kind that we have been talking about today, the only actual damages that would likely to be appraised against a defendant would be nominal at best. So we've got a lot of advantages. The courts have made our life relatively easy in the United States in their interpretation and application of fair use doctrine. Some features of our statute also work very much in favor of the kinds of activities that we've described today, and yet still institutions behave in ways that may be excessively cautious, or at least in my view, excessively cautious. So that brings us to the last thing that I want to talk toward today, and that is the way that in the last decade or so, a variety of practice communities in the United States have been working collectively to try to get out ahead of the courts, so to speak, to blaze new trails for the successful assertion of fair use in a variety of practice contexts. And it's been my great privilege working with a wonderful team at American University in Washington, D.C., where I am based, including my invaluable colleague, Professor Pat Aufderheide in the School of Communication there, to help with a lot, not all, but a number of these codes of best practices, beginning way back a decade ago with documentary filmmakers and proceeding through the most recent of the codes to be released, which is this one, the American Research Library's Code of Best Practices for Fair Use in Academic and Research Libraries. Now, these codes are designed to take advantage of a feature of U.S. fair use law that was first observed by our wonderful colleague Mike Madison of the University of Pittsburgh, who read all the fair use cases in the U.S. courts from the beginnings to what must have been then about 2004, and came up with some generalizations about the patterns he saw. And one of those patterns was that when U.S. courts, faced with the problem of applying fair use to some new situation, or at least new insofar as the courts are concerned, they look, when it exists, to documentation of what people in the field, whatever the field may be, think is legitimate, culturally positive, mission-related activity. And so what we've been trying to do with a variety of communities in this best practices work is to convene them to go through the process of developing for themselves consensus statements about the ways in which the unlicensed use of copyrighted material is critical to the fulfillment of their expressive, artistic, or cultural missions. The first best practices project to deal directly with archival issues came in 2009 when the Dance Heritage Coalition, which is the preeminent organization of dance collections in the United States, released its statement of best practices in fair use of dance-related materials, which deals with a wide range of situations in which copyright constraints come into conflict with the archival mission. And at least apparently, talking to the people I know and who I keep up with in the field of dance archiving, that statement has made a big difference. That statement has given many institutions the material they needed, the source of courage they needed to take or to make appropriate risk management decisions. More recently, this code I showed you a moment ago, the 2011 ARL code, addressed digitization for preservation, format migration, and, as Peter Hurdle will mention in a moment, the archival harvesting of websites. Now this team is hard at work on a document that will address best practices and fair use in the archival sector more generally. This began with a focus on the problem of orphan works in archives and library special collections, but the work, which should come to an end sometime at the end of this year, very early next year, has changed its focus somewhat. We're finishing 2 weeks from now a series of group interviews involving more than 100 archival professionals from all over the United States, north, south, east, west, at every level of activity. And our next job will, of course, be to distill from all of this material some common positions. As we have gone along, it's become clearer and clearer to us that the problem is not really an orphan works problem as such, not really a problem about establishing the appropriate standards of due diligence for search, as we had somewhat imagined it might be going in, that it is really a larger issue about how to proceed with the mass digitization of collections that include a mixture of public domain material, material with multiple known owners, and material whose ownership can't be readily determined. What's emerging from this discussion, and it would be getting ahead of the game to say a great deal more about what the outcome is going to be, is that, subject to some qualifications, most U.S. archival and special collections librarians, or most U.S. archivists and special collections librarians, believe strongly that their activities do represent significant and culturally positive, transformative educational uses that have a very close connection to overall institutional mission. There seems to be strong support, in other words, for an expansive approach to the application of fair use in this area, which we are going to try to mirror as faithfully as possible in this document. Although many of the special considerations that were reflected in the discussion of Codebreaker's clearance policy this morning also will be reflected. So I'm going to look forward very much to future developments here, and I hope that you will follow future developments in the U.S. for whatever value they may have, and it then simply falls to me in the end to thank the organizers of the meeting, the Wellcome Trust, CREATE, and everyone who has done such a splendid job of putting on this event for inviting me and making it possible for me to take part. Thank you very much.